Foundation, and we're delighted that everyone is here today to attend our discussion. With all the events going on in Washington with sequestration and other things, it's a great delight that a lot of people are here and on a Friday. So obviously many people are interested in what's going on in Georgia. Jamestown has a lot to say about it because we write about it pretty frequently in our publication, Eurasia Daily Monitor, and I'm sure many of you in the room subscribe to it and watch Jamestown in our publication, what we say about the region. We're very happy to have this discussion today. Obviously, Georgia has been very much a subject in a lot of people's minds recently, and we wanted to have a chance with some independent experts and to share their views and perspectives on the region and what's going on in Georgia. And it's a great pleasure for us to be able to have these three distinguished guests here. Obviously, the topic today is Georgia political power transfer and its international implications. We have a lot to cover today, and I think that no one will question how important Georgia is. For me personally, Georgia has been a great symbol for the post-Soviet space and the political evolution there of the political parties and the structure and evolution of democracy in the region. And Georgia has great implications, not just for Georgia, but for all the post-Soviet space. Last year, or earlier this year, I had a member of the representative of the Islamic Renaissance Party from Tajikistan was in our office, and they were talking about the great significance of what was happening in Georgia and what its impact was on Tajikistan. And it was certainly enlightening for me to hear someone from a remote part of Central Asia talk about how important Georgia is and what happens there. And I think all of the distinguished speakers today on this panel share that view. The October 1st parliamentary elections had a great impact on the region. I think first and foremost was a peaceful evolution, succession of power and transfer of power inside of Georgia. I think that has great importance for the post-Soviet space. Certainly with watching events in Ukraine and what's happened in Ukraine, it certainly has a much more quiet transfer of power, but obviously still in the news and still an issue of great controversy of what's happening in Georgia. And with Georgia's important strategic contributions in Afghanistan militarily, Georgia's role as a key transit route for the Northern Distribution Network, what Secretary Gates called the Caucasus spur of the Indian, has great importance. American aircraft and military personnel are using the Southern Corridor for transit, and more importantly, it has great strategic importance for the reverse transit of military equipment and goods from Afghanistan. So what happens inside of Georgia through this important strategic corridor is of great importance to the United States. And the speakers on our panel today share those views. Svante Cornell needs no introduction. He's very well known to many of you in this room. He's written a fabulous book on Azerbaijan and its history, and he's a very quite outspoken speaker. He's traveled, to every part of the Southern Caucasus and been dealing with it, and speaks Turkish fluently, and has a great understanding of Turkey as well. Damon Wilson is Vice President at the Atlantic Council. Damon has great experience in most senior levels of the U.S. government, involved in decision-making, and was involved in the December 2008 crisis in Georgia in the U.S. government. And so Damon has a lot of thoughts to share on the situation inside of Georgia and shares great concerns about what's happening there as well. And last but not least, after Damon, we have Vladimir Socor, and Vlad is the anchor of our publication, Eurasia Daily Monitor, and Vlad has been with this foundation for quite a long time, and sometimes he's referred to as Jamestown's Secretary of State because he's relentless in his efforts, constantly visiting every part of the from Moldova to Belarus to Georgia to Azerbaijan. He's just active everywhere, so and quite outspoken. And many of you enjoy his columns and have read him for a long time. So on that note today, I will open the floor to Svante, who will talk about what's going on in Georgia and what the international implications are for it. You can speak from here, that's fine, whatever you're comfortable.
People can see. Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure for the Central Asia Caucasus Institute to co-organize this event with the Jamestown Foundation. We've done this kind of arrangements in the past, and we hope to do so again. Of course, I'd like to start by talking a little bit about what's at stake in Georgia and why it matters. And I hope Glen is right that people don't need reminding. But unfortunately, I have a feeling that in the past several years, increasingly, the strategic rationale for the United States and for Europe for a deep level of engagement on a regional level in the South Caucasus is drifting, is perhaps slipping in some sense. And I think we probably need to continue to make the case, the strategic case, for why for 20 years as a part of a bipartisan effort, the United States has been so strongly involved in promoting both the development of free societies, but also strategic cooperation with the states in this region. And I think Georgia is of particular importance here because of two reasons, really. The most obvious reason is strategic and geographic, which is that Georgia is and remains the linchpin of the East-West corridor. It is the beginning point, if you will, of the western end of the East-West corridor that links Europe with the Caspian Sea and Central Asia. I don't have the time to go into the details of all the areas in which this matters. It matters in terms of the energy corridor from the Caspian to Europe. It matters in the military supply linkages into Afghanistan from NATO and out of Afghanistan again now. It matters in terms of the much longer-term process of building the commercial connections, the land bridge between Europe and both South and East Asia. And in all of these areas, Georgia is crucial because it is the bottleneck, if you will, from the western end of the corridor. And it is also the only country of Central Asia and the Caucasus not to be landlocked, and therefore has its ports that are of key strategic importance as well. And therefore, particular attention has always been paid to Georgia in a positive way by its Western partners and in a less positive way by its northern neighbor for exactly this reason. The other reason why Georgia matters is symbolic, I think, and it relates to the domestic development of Georgia and the fact that Georgia has been, certainly in its regional context, the most liberal and the most progressive country in terms of reforming its internal political system. And symbolically, of course, the legacy of the Rose Revolution, which started off the several color revolutions in the former Soviet Union. It was the only one left standing, and of course, and I'll speak about this in a minute, the symbolic value of building on the progress that was made 10 years ago is very important, particularly with a view of the negative trends that are happening in Ukraine. So let me move to that issue, and I think this is not a panel about the legacy of the Rose Revolution and of the 9 years of power of Mr. Saakashvili, but I think we need to appraise, and historians, it's probably too early to make a real comprehensive appraisal of this issue, but we need to look at both, of course, the achievements and the shortcomings. Because you can't really understand the developments in Georgia and how to help Georgia forward without making such an assessment. And of course, this must be cursory and very summary in a way. But I think that if we begin with the achievements of the Rose Revolution in the years that followed, the first one may not be immediately visible for people who did not visit Georgia before 2003, namely the reversal of state failure. I think that sums up the major achievement of the Rose Revolution. Now, the reversal of state failure is actually quite rare. There is much more of a political science debate on what are the reasons and the processes of state failure. Nobody has really researched how countries escape state failure. But I think that's what happened in Georgia. You all know some of the elements of this. The breaking down of petty corruption in Georgia, that was very successful, which is visible in all of the international indicators, Transparency International and others. The improvement of tax collection of the state budget quadrupling in a couple of years with lower tax rates. The deregulation of the Soviet legacy, if you will, legal environment for doing business and other issues. the creation of facilitation of government services for the population, the justice houses that were implemented, and so on. I think what needs to be mentioned is also the dislodging of organized crime, which had been a very powerful influence on Georgian political life. The reforms in the education sector, I see Kacha Lomaya sitting there, who was Minister of Education, institutionalizing the system of centralized exams instead of the completely corrupt system of the higher education in Georgia that had existed before. So these are, in the primary area, I think, achievements in the area of state building. It is important, I think, also to mention one less tangible, perhaps, radical departure that the Saakashvili administration did, which was in the very area of Georgian identity, of helping Georgia transition from what had been a very ethno-religiously defined concept of what it meant of being a Georgian to one that was more civic-based and inclusive and open towards the many citizens of Georgia who are not Orthodox Christian or ethnic Georgians. In fact, bringing about a more European conception of what the nation was all about. And of course, I think we need to mention the successes in European integration, the fact that Georgia is a serious candidate both for an association agreement with the European Union and for a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement is testimony to this. Of course, there is the other side, which is what the Rose Revolution and its successor and its 9 years in power did not achieve, the shortcomings, if you will. These have been widely discussed as well in this city, so I don't need to go into the details. But just in summary, I think there is a sense that the leaders of Georgia sometimes perceived a choice between democratization and state building, sometimes as a result of real or perceived Russian threats against Georgia. And there was a tendency in some areas to choose state building over democratization when there was a perceived conflict between the two. In the early days, this may have been understandable, I think, in terms of the fact that a state is a prerequisite for democracy, not the other way around. You can't have a democracy without a state. But I think over time, this did not change to a sufficient extent. In a way, you could say that the leaders failed to move from being revolutionaries to being managers. You could see this, for example, in the continued existence of a kitchen cabinet kind of structure of decision-making rather than an institutionalization of decision-making. Many of the other elements of this are quite well known. The continued dominant party political system, which blurred sometimes the lines between the party and the state. The electoral system that strongly favored the ruling United National Movement. There were very widely publicized issues about the the lack of improvement of the freedom of the media in Georgia. I think to most people this was most epitomized by the crackdown on the Imedi TV station and the disturbances of 2007. Other issues included, I think, the many reports that were coming out of Georgia about intimidation of opposition fundraising, wiretapping of the opposition, especially in the later periods before 2012 elections, and in 2012, I think, an election campaign in which the OSCE and other international organizations found that the measures against the opposition were disproportionate in terms of punitive measures and fines and other issues. I think on the overall, there was an issue of ends versus means, I think, that in the early days, the government that came to power sensed a need to break some eggs to make an omelet, if you will. This may have been necessary to fight entrenched corruption and organized crime, but I think the problem is that these methods did not go away. To some extent, there continued to be a sense that in some areas the ends justify the means, and I think unfortunately this led to the fact that the rule of law was not strongly entrenched in Georgia and remained one of the areas where much more progress needs to be made. We saw this in the issues of the questionable expropriations of property, among other. The prison abuse scandal is, of course, well known as well. And at the end of the day, also, the economic policies, unfortunately, failed to generate jobs in big numbers or to eradicate poverty. To what extent this was dependent on, this would have been different if the 2008 financial crisis had not happened, we will never know. I won't go too much into the Russia issue here. We don't have time for that. But there is a sense to a lot of people that everything that I've just talked about, both the accomplishments and the shortcomings, were overshadowed by the fact that there was a war in 2008, which Georgia lost. Just very briefly, in my opinion, I think the issue is much more complicated, and the fact that Russia has, under Vladimir Putin, continuously sought to undermine Georgia long before Mr. Saakashvili came to power, long before the Rose Revolution. And the pressure from Russia got worse, mainly because Georgia, under Saakashvili, refused to continue to allow a Russian influence over Georgian domestic politics. It refused to allow a Russian droit de regard, to use the French term, over the cabinet appointments of the Interior, the Defense, and other ministries. And it uncompromisingly continued to separate Georgia from the Soviet past. Now, Mr. Saakashvili's government did not handle this tactfully. I think that may be something we can all agree on. And the rhetoric that came out of Tbilisi sometimes made the situation worse than it had to be. But the fundamental fact was that Russia under Mr. Putin would not allow Georgia to become an independent Western democratic state and worked very strongly to undermine that. And even some of the negative sides of the 9 past years, I think, are connected to what you could call an overreaction in some areas to Russian efforts to continuously undermine Georgia. My general sense, if you will, is that, of course, Georgia under Saakashvili did not become an established, full-fledged democracy. It wouldn't be credible to claim that, but it's also not credible to claim, as some do, that Georgia was a tyranny, that Georgia had become a totalitarian state where everybody lived in fear. Anyone able to compare Georgia with its neighborhood in the South Caucasus and in the post-Soviet space more broadly, I think can clearly see that the difference that Georgia had made under the past, in the past decade, that the Georgia under Mr. Saakashvili had a lot of very bright sides. It also had some rather darker sides. And I think recognizing all that, the Georgia of 2012 was incomparably better than the Georgia of 2003. What is needed today, therefore, I think, is not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, if you will. That is to say, to keep and to safeguard and improve upon many of the good accomplishments of the Rose Revolution, while, of course, reversing and addressing the shortcomings that I mentioned. A balanced approach, if you will. And the question then is, where do we stand today? And I think, of course, the first thing we have to say is that it's very early to make any, you can't really make any conclusive assessment. The new government has been in power for just over 100 days. It's very much a formative period, and we can see some tendencies and some trends, but we cannot make any, so to speak, conclusive verdict about what is going on. But this is true, I think, especially in the economic sphere. Now, the government spokespeople will often make the point that there are two things that people really want in Georgia: that's jobs and justice. And in the economic sphere, whether the jobs are coming, I think, is still very early. You can't expect results to come that soon. We see some economic policies in the areas of lowering of utility fees, raising of salaries and pensions, New Year bonuses and things like that, which are, of course, very well received by the population. But I think we still are waiting for the structural and deeper reforms and to see whether they will be responsible or whether they will be, so to speak, responding to some of the more populist demands that are coming from the population. Regarding the justice issue, I think that's one of the most controversial ones, which has garnered the most attention in recent weeks and months. And the politics in the country, I think, are dominated by the confrontation between the new government and, on the one hand, and President Saakashvili and the parliamentary minority on the other. And I think one of the issues that people are most interested in is the widespread use of the judiciary to target members of the former government. Now, one question you might ask is, why has this gotten so much attention? And I think one of the reasons is that it raises questions because even in Central and Eastern European countries after the collapse of communism after 1989, most countries did not deploy prosecutors with zealous prosecutors against members of the former governing party, even the communist governing party. And the question in many people's mind is, why is, therefore, the current Georgian government so zealously questioning and prosecuting and detaining members of the former government? Is this, if you will, are the cases seen as well prepared? Do prosecutors appear to target the right people or to select them for political purposes? These are the questions, I think, that are very difficult to disentangle. But I think overall, I think the conclusion that I would reach is that so far the Georgian new authorities have failed to convince the international community of the legitimacy and the credibility of this broader judicial process against the former authorities. Summarizing, if you will, perhaps not necessarily my views, but the general sense that I think is prevalent in Europe and in the United States is that the cases very often have not seemed to be very well prepared. Specific opponents of the new government, popular UNM leaders, appear to have been singled out. The government rhetoric, including by the Prime Minister himself, sometimes seems to indicate that the arrest would stop if the former government officials would be more cooperative with the priorities of the new government. That is something that should be, I think, has created quite a lot of concern. And in parallel, we see on the local level across Georgia the takeover of local government institutions across the country, which also has raised a lot of eyebrows. And I'd note especially that when I was in Georgia in December, I happened to talk with the chief of the Polish presidential administration, who happened to be in town on a visit, and he was making exactly this case at a panel that, you know, we debated very strongly after 1989 how we were going to handle the former regime. And we decided that we were not going to deploy all the prosecutors against them, although we really wanted these people to be in jail because they had thrown us in jail. And the question from the Polish perspective was, why is this going on in Georgia to that extent? And I don't think that the answer that has come out has been fully satisfactory to the international community, as it perhaps should be. Now, I would like to stress that this is not to say that Mr. Saakashvili and what is now the parliamentary minority has been purely constructive in its approach. Far from it. But it is now the government that holds the main levers of power, and therefore it is a government that is ultimately facing most of the international attention to what it is doing. I think another issue that we may discuss perhaps in the question and answer session is what the power dynamics within the ruling coalition are. Mr. Ivanishvili built his legitimacy, especially externally, very much on the inclusion of the Republican Party and the Free Democrats, led by Mr. Alassania, into his coalition. The question that many people are asking now is whether these pro-Western, pro-democratic forces maintain their influence over the Prime Minister, or whether other forces that perhaps don't share these values are trying to vie for influence and becoming influential. The public sidelining by Mr. Ivanishvili of Mr. Alassania and his demotion from the Deputy Prime Minister post raised very questions, especially because of what is said about Mr. Ivanishvili's leadership style, I believe, and we can talk about that too. I guess I'm running out of time, but let me just say a few words about the external aspects and the foreign policy aspect. In these areas, I think we also we see especially Mr. Ivanishvili, not a politician by training, who is adapting to the role of not only a domestic political leader, but also that of a foreign policy leader, which I think is a learning process, definitely, and we need to give him the benefit of the doubt in that area. And I think the positive aspects, of course, are the commitment to the EU and NATO processes that the new Georgian government has maintained. I think the problem is that there's a drift in the Western policy and in the willingness of the ability and willingness of Western partners to really engage Georgia quite significantly and sufficiently in these areas. I think more importantly in the short term is Georgia's relations with its neighbors, particularly Turkey and Azerbaijan, which are of course the bedrock of Georgia's regional alliance system, if you will. Its stability, its regional role is built on the East-West corridor, and therefore its relationship with Turkey and Azerbaijan are of paramount importance for the entire strategic rationale that Georgia is playing in the region. And I think here there has been a rocky start, I think it's fair to say, with both Azerbaijan and Turkey. Although I understand that the Prime Minister's visit to Turkey was quite a successful one. In parallel, of course, relations with Russia. I think the government is very wise in taking a very slow and step-by-step approach to this and not seeming to have very large illusions about what it could achieve. And I think that is good, because the risk is otherwise that you would risk getting burnt very easily in relationship with Mr. Putin's Russia. To conclude, I'd like to say a few words only about the international reaction, if you will, and the West's approach. And I think the problem, again, as I said initially, is a problem of a lack of sufficient engagement. What is needed right now is a redoubling of the efforts of Western European and American engagement in Georgia to support and help the very difficult process of cohabitation between the new government and the president for a period of most of this year, which I think is going to offer many risks and many challenges rather than many opportunities. And I think both sides of the Georgian political spectrum need help and need guidance from its partners in the West on how to deal with this. And it is not my sense that this has been sufficiently forthcoming. And I'd like to say that it seems to me, unfortunately, that the European Union so far has been much more active and much more involved in this process. And I never thought I would say this, but that the Europeans have been more active in this process than has been the United States. The U.S. position, or the activities of the U.S. are mostly handled by the ambassador in Tbilisi, which I think has done exactly the right thing for a U.S. ambassador, which is to try to build the best relations possible with the new government in the country and play a constructive role. But I think what is needed is not, the ambassador in Tbilisi cannot do this on his own. There needs to be a much higher level focus on the part of the U.S. authorities to the process in Georgia, and much more senior people in the U.S. Government as well as Congress need to be involved in supporting the process of developing Georgia's democratic institutions, as well as reinforcing its strategic partnership with Georgia. But for that, I think there is a need, again, for more of a reappraisal of the strategic rationale for the U.S. to be involved in Georgia. And I'm not sure that this is always, that this regional approach that has been a bipartisan consensus in this country for the past 20 years is really being fully utilized to the extent that it should. Let me stop here, perhaps, and hand the floor over to you, Glenn.
All right. Damon, thank you very much for that wide sweeping assessment of what's going on in Georgia from both the international and also domestic perspective. And so Damon, I'll let you carry this forward.
Terrific, terrific. Thank you very much, Glenn. It's a pleasure to be here. I just want to thank you first, Glenn, and the Jamestown Foundation for helping to really keep a spotlight on Georgia, but also the broader region. I think the work that you've done, the talent you've recruited has just been a tremendous contribution to the debate in Washington in terms of keeping us engaged and keeping this town focused on some very difficult issues. It's also a real pleasure to be here with Vlad and Svante, two good friends and colleagues who know a heck of a lot more than I do about the region, but have been terrific people to work with over the years, as well as many of you out there in the audience who follow these issues extraordinarily closely. I wanted to come at this a little bit more again, as I often do. My objective is to talk about it from the perspective of a policymaker in many respects. I struggled to have made the transition from policymaker to analyst, and so I tend to keep my policy hat on. And I think part of the objective that I have in sort of remaining engaged in these conversations and events like today is it's extraordinarily important to continue to forge and build a community, which is a community of folks right here in this room, of people that are interested and committed to Georgia, no matter what's happening in the country, committed to the idea of a Georgia in the West through the ups and downs, which we're going to inevitably experience. To step back and remember that what we're talking about is almost an audacious concept. It's an audacious goal to think about a free market democratic Georgia embedded in the transatlantic community. And people up here, you in the audience, you are the community that's going to help determine whether this can succeed or not. And I'm betting on it. It's part of what's I think also important is our whole posture as we approach what's happening in Georgia. If we solely approach it from an analyst perspective, we often take a judging tone, what's good, what's bad, and I'll talk about some of that as well. But it is important to remember from a policymaker's perspective what our posture is, that we actually have we're not ambivalent observers. We are invested in shaping the outcome, we're invested in success, we're invested in being partners of Georgia on this incredible journey. And so I think Svante is actually right in that you can't skip over or take for granted sort of the strategic rationale for why all of this matters in the first place. He mentioned Georgia's evolution from a failed state to an aspirant state. It's a pretty remarkable trajectory with a lot of work still to be done. The demonstration effect of what will happen with success or failure in Georgia for not just the region, but for broader Eurasia. It's also part of a larger strategic perspective that I have when I think about U.S. national security policy that I'll come towards the end of this conversation. And it's about what the significance of this network of free market democracies is to U.S. national security. It's not a peripheral issue, in my view, to U.S. national security. It's at the core of a successful long-term U.S. national security strategy in which we head into an ever more complex world where our values are often challenged. Having a web and network of nations that actually are embedded with us in terms of the same values and interests is a core, I think, to thinking about the long-term perspective of the United States in the coming years. Not to mention the strategic issues that Glen and others have mentioned, from energy to the link, or if you will, the lifeline to the Caspian and Central Asia as well. Let me step back a little bit. I spent last night with President Kwasniewski, who's in town, and he was very focused on Ukraine, as he usually is. But what was striking in the conversation is to think about the role, the transformational role that a former Polish communist played, not only in leading his own nation to NATO and the European Union, solidifying democratic institutions and a free market democracy, but the role that he's played in public life after stepping down to be able to help continue to shape and advance the values and interests of a common community. And it helps sort of shape and overshadow, I think, our conversation a little bit today. And so if we dive into Georgia, as we are sort of now, we're just over the first 100 days. And I think, understandably, there's a bit of a mixed record, some real positive signs, some real points of concern. And just briefly to touch on those. I mean, you can't underestimate the value and the impact of this constitutional transfer, democratic transfer of power, and the moral authority that I think that it provides to Georgia as a country, but also the opportunity, the moral authority is an opportunity that it provided to the government. A degree of credibility that can be spent, can be squandered, but is certainly real. There is a diversity in this coalition, while some people like to point at it as a point of criticism, because there's a variety of views, including on some sensitive both domestic and foreign policy issues. But the diversity in the coalition is also a strength, I think, and it's translated into a number of appointments throughout the government of quite strong professionals, who many of you know, who many of us have worked with, that provide credibility to the perspective and the voice of this new government, and real genuine partners that everyone in the transatlantic community knows that they can work with. There's a credible platform of jobs and justice, of democracy, Euro-Atlantic integration, agricultural reform, normalization of relations with Russia, health issues. All of this makes eminent sense. And it also has addressed a few of the key weaknesses that in the past, really the political opposition's weakness in Georgia in the past was one of Georgia's Achilles heel in terms of its foreign policy objectives, that the ability to move towards the West without having an opposition that was seen as being a credible partner that could actually govern the country was a real liability. And in many respects, this election helped put that to rest and underscored the role that democracy plays as a long-term insurance policy for Georgia's place in the world. But at the same time, if we look at where we've come over the past several months, cohabitation isn't working so well. Now, that's not completely surprising. This is a long-term process of the maturation of Georgian democratic politics. But a winner-take-all mentality is actually corrosive and dangerous for Georgia rather than a source of strength. There remains a real responsibility to respect President Saakashvili's term in office and his responsibilities, and for the president to respect and give due deference to the government to govern. And one of my concerns is to see a positive agenda of governance being overshadowed by particular obsession with the president himself or with issues of the past. Svante mentioned some of the 30 arrests that have taken place. And I think one of the real issues here is how do you go through a process of having rule of law and real justice without developing a culture of criminalizing political differences? The Justice Minister was in Washington just last week, and I had a terrific meeting with her where she underscored two things. The importance as minister of creating a next government culture. And I think that is spot on. How do ministers today think about every action, every decision they take, setting a precedent for how they will be treated when they aren't the minister any longer? This next government culture needs to permeate the decision-making, the thinking on the way forward of this government to help avoid the trap of criminalizing political differences and falling into a very difficult process that will actually undermine the ability to achieve governance and to achieve their objectives. She also made the point that there is a real demand and a real interest in certain issues of justice. I get that. I understand that. But she also made the point that just because folks are angry doesn't mean they are right. And that is an incredible, important insight of anyone in government, to have that sense of responsibility, so that as this process continues, that not just both the Georgian people, but also the international community are convinced of due process, are convinced of a commitment to next government culture, and are convinced to the credibility of establishing rule of law in Georgia, not a culture of revenge. This speaks to some of the issues that are playing out. And Svante mentioned, for example, the local councils. 30 of 75 of the local executives have been removed, all from UNM. 13 of the local elected council chairs as well. This is a very unhealthy process. These folks are being removed through intimidation, through challenges, and I think part of the beauty of what happened in this election is it showed the power of the Georgian people to make choices and to change their leadership through the ballot box, through constitutional processes. And I think that that remains a fundamental of importance, whether it's happening on the local level or the national level. The same applies inside the parliament. This government doesn't have a constitutional majority. And in many respects, I say, thank goodness. A constitutional majority would be an albatross for any government. I remember some of our conversations with officials from the UNM during election periods saying, you have a particular responsibility because you are the government, so you bear the particular burden of responsibility and how to manage and administer a free environment for elections, to strengthen the democratic process, but also how you govern in Parliament as well. And I think that what we saw in a recent vote, the numbers are inching upward, 91 out of 100 voting on one recent contentious bill, the amnesty bill. And I think it needs to be very clear that this idea of attaining a constitutional majority will not be a blessing for a governing coalition. It will become an albatross for any governing coalition as a stepping stone on how to exert a complete influence, winner-take-all philosophy, not preparing for a next government culture, and becoming more of a liability to an asset in terms of moving forward with a positive agenda. I think part of this culture we've seen of disappointment is the debacle over the State of the Union address, in which the President was barred from addressing Parliament, and in which the address went forward in the context of a renewed spirit of violence, which was very unwelcome, certainly in Georgia. Part of the responsibility I think that this government has and that we're going through right now in Georgia is what the outgoing U.S. ambassador in Georgia, who delivered a very thoughtful, compelling, valedictory address. So this is really part of the mental revolution of Georgia. Yes, you had the Rose Revolution, but the mental revolution continues. And that continues to underscore the burden of responsibility of strengthening rather than degrading certain norms that are taking root in Georgian society, pushing back on trends of being xenophobic or homophobic or religious and ethnic chauvinism, putting to rest the history of divisiveness and division in Georgian society, and looking how to continue to build on that, of a president that respects the government's role to govern, and that a government that respects the role of the president, that ensures that state institutions that have gone from almost failed state to functioning, that these state institutions continue to function, the reforms, police, for example, that respect for shared powers continue to take place. The fact that UNM, the Gigi Ugalava, mayor of Tbilisi, that is a good thing and should be continued to play out in the normal course of politics in Georgia. that the professionalization of the civil service strengthen, not weaken, and that a culture of political retribution really be put to rest. Excuse me. One of the things that we wanted to focus on in this context is the international implications of what's taking place in Georgia. So let me shift, if I will, a little bit to that perspective, because I think that has some of the most important impact in thinking about U.S. policy. First, all of this is happening in Georgia in the context of some tectonic plates that are shifting. First, you have President Putin and Russia that perhaps is focused more on the restoration of empire, on how to pursue the challenge that the government in Georgia faces is how to pursue normalization of relations with Russia as Russia is focused on building a Eurasian Union, which creates an inevitable tension. While Ukraine remains the prize, I think, in the Kremlin's construct, as President Kwasniewski put it last night, Georgia is a source of heated potential vengeance in Russian policymakers. And so navigating this path smartly is a challenge, but it's an effort that I applaud the government taking on in terms of doing this carefully, cautiously, in a way that checks and verifies Georgian interests in the process. But the European Union itself, which needs to be an anchor of activity in Georgia, as Svante says, I think you just watched what happened with the Italian elections, the corruption scandal in Spain, but the primacy of the Eurozone crisis, the future of where the European Union goes will remain the dominating, animating issue with Europe. The one positive thing about the European Union's engagement is there is a degree of consistency, in part thanks to Swedish and Polish and Lithuanian leadership, but also in terms of the process inside the EU, the commitment to developing out the Eastern Partnership, the pathway towards the Vilnius Summit that opens up real incentives and possibilities for the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement, association agreement, visa travel. And I think Georgia wants to keep its eye on the prize of how it stays at the lead of the class and not begin to slip behind Ukraine or even Moldova in this process. Svante also rightly mentioned that the role that Turkey plays, the international implications of Turkey, extraordinarily significant for Georgia. Turkey is a country on the rise of influence in the international community, absolutely focused on the crisis in Syria right now, however, looking south, less so eastward. And that we're seeing some interesting dynamics taking place, for example, of Turkey's relationship with Europe and German Chancellor Merkel's recent opening to the idea of a closer relationship of Turkey inside Europe. Georgia is fundamentally invested in this conversation because a Turkey that is unequivocally embedded in Europe and embedded in the West really can help serve as a continuing anchor for Georgia in its move to Europe and the West. And I think that relationship should be at the top of the agenda in Tbilisi, not just as a political opportunity, but certainly as an economic anchor and opportunity as well. And then the United States. I mean, this is, I'll conclude with thoughts on the United States posture and policy. Obviously, we're in the process of a drawdown in Afghanistan, while ISAF and transit to Afghanistan have remained real strategic anchors in our relationship with Georgia, and that won't disappear overnight. It is of diminishing importance and prominence in the coming years. I do believe we've gone through a period of exaggerated discussion of a pivot to Asia. And I think we're going to be witnessing an opportunity of almost a restoration of the importance and role of Europe in U.S. policy. And it really plays in, this is where I think Georgia fits into a much larger puzzle. If the United States is not interested in Europe, how is the United States interested in Georgia? And so to get Georgia, U.S. policy towards Georgia right, fundamentally depends on getting U.S. policy towards Europe right. And I see a tremendous opportunity in the President Obama's second term and real positive indications and signs that we're moving in a direction to help reestablish, sort of rebalance, if you will, back to Europe. Secretary Kerry very intentionally designed a first trip as Secretary of State to include Europe as an anchor, and to begin to build on the building blocks of what you heard in President Obama's first term of a vision of Europe as a catalyst for U.S. Global action, but also as a cornerstone for U.S. engagement in the world. Beginning to shift away from almost an ambivalent posture of how Europe is developing to a recognition of the enormous strategic stake we have in how the future of Europe. And frankly, that as we move into a more complex world, a world in which the West, for the first time during this president, will represent less than 50% of global output, that we need now an even more compelling argument to have a cohesive, coherent West dealing with this diverse array of challenges. And so I see a broadening strategy coming up, one that I'm arguing for, that really is built on the backbone of 3 pillars that gives Georgia a home in U.S. policy rather than as an outlier of U.S. policy. The first begins with this restoration of the economic foundation of the international strength of the transatlantic relationship. The flagship keystone of that, you heard in the President's State of the Union, is the U.S.-Europe Jobs and Growth Pact, not just to move forward with a Georgia free trade agreement, which is very difficult to do on its own, but in the context of a much more ambitious, strategically relevant binding of the markets across the Atlantic, in which Georgia can also take a place, which puts a focus on the strength and power and dynamism of this economic relationship rather than the current focus on the stagnation of the economic space in Europe. The second part of this is really an intentional effort to recognize that, yes, we have to continue to work with our European partners on issues of global consequence, hence the role in Afghanistan, Georgia's role in Afghanistan of utmost importance, but increasingly this issues of global consequence but regional reach, and where we focus a more coherent transatlantic strategy on this great belt of uncertainty on Europe's peripheral, from the Sahel, Middle East, North Africa, Israel, Palestine, Syria, Iran, Iraq, into Afghanistan, but that also includes the Caucasus and Russia. This is a swath of territory that Europe will never walk away from, and that the United States and Europe are not coherent on today. Having a more coherent transatlantic strategy of issues of global consequence but regional reach embeds Georgia in that prioritization. But the final place to this is also the United States' recognition that it is still a European power, and that the United States still has an investment in the project of completing Europe. That starts with a more coherent, cohesive European Union. The European project, after all, was and is an American project. We're not ambivalent. We need a more cohesive Europe as a partner. The second part is recognition that Europe is not yet done. The Western Balkans, the South Caucasus, Europe's East, that the Eastern Partnership doesn't mean the United States has ceded the game to the European Union, that we find the right supporting role to finish this role with Georgia at the heart of that, recognizing that if we take our eye off the ball, we certainly can invite security problems and challenges, whether it be in Bosnia or the South Caucasus, and that we're still invested in this narrative of completing Europe, where we don't need fundamental major shifts in paradigm or decisions quite yet at the moment. We need small steps continuing on Montenegro, on Moldova, on Georgia. But embedding this also in a long-term strategy towards Russia, a recognition that everything that the United States and Europe does today towards Russia doesn't need to be contributing to the status quo in that country, but needs to be contributing over to the long term to helping to tip the balance of the historic debate in Russia on whether Russia is a part of Europe and the West or not. This isn't a short-term effort, but it does mean that our actions today need to be taken in the context of not just beggar-thy-neighbor strategies in terms of short-term gain, but how does our engagement today contribute to this long-term solution? I've gone on a little bit long. Let me conclude with that, Glenn. But part of getting our approach and attention to Georgia right is having coherence in how we think about Europe and Eurasia. And the absence of clarity on a U.S. strategy and approach to Europe and Eurasia, Georgia will be up and down, not tethered to clarity and outcome. If, as I see emerging right now in Washington, a willingness to rebalance our policy and focus back on the role that Europe plays on so many fundamental issues, a recognition that we are moving into an incredibly complex world that is going to be challenging our values and our interests. And as we do that, that Europe is our base of creating a community of shared values and interests, a community of shared democracies and free markets, that's such a critical element to our national security strategy over the next 20 years, and that Georgia has a home in the context of that priority of our national security strategy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Damon. That's I really appreciate your insights and where Georgia should lie within U.S. priorities. I will turn this over now to Vlad, and make sure your mic's on. Vlad?
Thank you, Glenn. Svante mentioned that Georgia was an incomparably better place in 2012 compared to 2003, incomparably. And Damon said that bringing Georgia from where it used to be into the West is an audacious project. Of course, both statements go right to the heart of the matter. And I would like in my remarks to evaluate how the outcome of the latest parliamentary elections in Georgia are impacting on Georgia's performance as a state and on the Western audacious project to bring that country into the West. I believe that the outcome of the elections has been a setback to those objectives on many counts. Before proceeding with this evaluation, I'd like, however, to preface my remarks by saying that I advocate continuing re-engagement with the existing authorities, with Mr. Ivanishvili. I advocate a similar approach in relation to Ukraine under Mr. Yanukovych. It is necessary to work with the incumbent leaderships. Otherwise, we'll risk losing the country to Russian influence, and we risk losing influence over the country's internal reform processes. Working with the incumbent state leadership is unavoidable, indispensable, and necessary in the West's own interests. But we need to be clear-eyed about the nature and the objectives of the incumbent leadership. And here is where I assess the outcome of the latest elections as a setback on 3 counts. First, institution building. Second, policy making and performance in government. And thirdly, foreign and regional policies. In all these 3 areas, we are witnessing setbacks. We don't know yet whether these setbacks will prove short-term, and if so, how short-term, or long-term. But we need re-engagement with the leadership to make sure that we can, at least in part, steer the processes in a desirable direction. First setback on institution building. The outcome of these elections has marked something which I wrote about extensively during the electoral campaign as state capture by one individual, the country's richest businessman, with personal assets estimated at 1/2 of Georgia's entire GDP. It is a state capture in the sense that this person has become the uncontested paramount state leader with ultimate decisions on all issues that matter. He is literally the owner of the parliamentary majority, because as I showed in an analysis, name-by-name analysis of Mr. Ivanishvili's parliamentary election list, most of them had been recipients of Mr. Ivanishvili's admittedly generous philanthropic spending to various cultural, sports, athletic, and other figures of this kind. They are not professional politicians. They are artists, sportsmen, about 6 or 7 karate fighters among them, football players, and so on. So they received salaries for many years from Mr. Ivanishvili's praiseworthy generosity. And some of Mr. Ivanishvili's closest personal associates from before the elections, such as the head of his car-to-bank operations in Georgia, and his Irakli Gabarishvili, and his personal lawyer, Arshil Kiblashvili, are now Interior Minister and General Prosecutor, respectively. State capture there. So the outlook for checks and balances is poor. If instituting checks and balances in Georgia was a US objective, this objective has receded from view. No checks and balances there. With the executive authority, law enforcement, and parliamentary majority controlled by one pair of hands. The same is true of the combination of state resources and private resources, which will from now on be in Mr. Ivanishvili's hands. Prior to this election, or rather the election of 2012, amounted to a contest between administrative resources controlled by the government and Mr. Ivanishvili's private resources. Now, both of these sets of resources are now controlled by one power center. No checks and balances there. Mr. Ivanishvili's broad coalition of 6 parties is a coalition in name only, which reminds me of the coalitions in Central and Eastern Europe in the middle and late 1940s. The minor parties were entirely dependent on Georgian Dream Party during the electoral campaign for financing. They had no financial or social base on their own, and are now minor allies to Mr. Ivanishvili, who sometimes allows himself to humiliate allied leaders, such as has Irakli Alassania recently. Mr. Ivanishvili, or rather Georgian Dream, won the elections as a result of successful building of what I have described as a coalition of malcontents. 2 types of malcontents. Those who had lost out because of the economic reforms instituted by Mr. Saakashvili and his team after starting in 2004, the opening of the economy, and the dismissal of superfluous state officials, including but not only those from the police, mass dismissals, and many other constituencies that lost out from the reforms. And these constituencies range from the former Soviet elite and Shevardnadze era elite, symbolized by Tbilisi's Vake neighborhood, ranging all the way to unemployed industrial workers who provide those constant 8% of Shalvan Atelashvili's voters, and ranging from all those who had lost out in income and status as a result of the reforms, those beyond middle age who were completely left behind by Georgia's modernization, and of course, the very numerous extended families who benefited from organized crimes on various levels. Those were the economic malcontents, but there was also a range of constituencies of cultural malcontents. There were those segments of the Georgian population that perceived a threat from Western cultural influences versus Georgia's traditional national and religious identity. This kind of sentiment was important in the 2012 election. It was also the first election in which the church, or at least parts of the church, significant parts of the church, intervened in the political arena, urging voters to oppose the government perceived as a conveyor of Western influences that undermine Georgia's national and cultural identity. The Georgian church intervened with this kind of message during the election. Although the patriarch issued a statement urging the clergy not to do this, parts of the clergy did this. This is another setback in terms of civic education of the Georgian nation and its Europeanization. We also have to look at the electoral map of Georgia to understand the significance of the outcome. The ethnic minorities, Armenian and Azerbaijani minority in Georgia, traditionally voted for the incumbent presidents and the incumbent governments. This put the incumbents over the top. Remember the elections of presidential election of January 2008, which Mr. Saakashvili won with 53% of the vote, and when he garnered almost 100% or 90% of the Armenian and Azerbaijani votes, which means that even at that time, a majority of ethnic Georgians voted against, or rather he fell short of a majority among ethnic Georgians. This time around, that was in January 2008, this time around, Armenian votes divided between the two candidates, between the two camps, and I think the government still carried overwhelmingly the Azerbaijani vote, but not as heavily as before. And in the ethnic Georgian regions, Mr. Saakashvili's party retained its bastion in Mingrelia. But otherwise, a majority of ethnic Georgians clearly voted, this time, against the incumbent party. And there was also an irrationality factor in this, because the governing party lost those areas in which it had made the heaviest economic investments. Ajaria, with Batumi especially. Mestia, it lost Mestia, where this government pulled Mestia out of pre-Soviet patriarchal backwardness into the modern age. And it lost it. It lost Kutaisi, where the government did a lot of stimulus spending with the building of the new parliament and the project of a new airport. So there was this factor of irrationality also in this voting. Again, I think it corroborates the proposition that it was a populist, if you will, backlash against the reforms as carried out by the government. So those are the first set of, or combination of setbacks. The second has to do with policymaking and the performance of governments, of the government. We have seen very hesitant steps on the part of an inexperienced government, which resulted in major gaffes on foreign policy. Denying or questioning very publicly the benefits of the agreement on natural gas with Azerbaijan, which is highly beneficial for Georgia. Questioning loudly the benefits of the projected, almost completed railroad Kars Tbilisi-Baku, financed on the Georgian section entirely by Azerbaijan. Some stirring up of anti-Turkish sentiment in connection with the reconstruction of a historic mosque in Batumi, in return, by the way, for the reconstruction of 2 historic churches on Turkish territory. An initial proposal by the reintegration minister to acknowledge Abkhazia and Ossetia as parties to the conflict, which if implemented, would have set back the achievement from 2009, whereby the international community recognized Russia as a party to the conflict, not Abkhazia and Ossetia. The astonishing appointment of a football star as energy minister in a sector which is actually Georgia's national destiny. Transit is Georgia's national destiny. Why a football player was appointed minister has yet to be explained. And then, of course, there is the problem of selective justice, which my colleagues on the panel have already discussed in great detail. Setbacks again. US policy. Georgia was, to my knowledge, a unique case worldwide in which the United States was openly the arbiter of the domestic politics. The United States served as a source of legitimacy and conflict arbitration for Georgia's political forces. When political opposition groups had grievances, they went to the US Embassy. US embassies assessing Georgia's political situation, internal political situation, ever since 2007 practically. Those US embassy statements were scrutinized word for word by the political forces and the civil society and analyzed and overanalyzed for the implication of every word. Mr. Saakashvili made the United States into this sort of political arbiter in Georgia. It was he who built this kind of unique relationship. How did the United States capitalize on this unique asset, which it never enjoyed in any country of the world? And it, by the way, an asset like this reflects reflects Georgia's vulnerability vis-à-vis Russia and reflects Georgia's weakness in the final analysis. So the Georgian government clung desperately to the connection with the United States at a time when Europe was not yet a major political actor within Georgia or in the region. Now it is, now it's becoming one. I think the United States did not sufficiently capitalize on its unique assets which it held. In my opinion, the overriding goal of the United States approaching the elections in Georgia was to find an elegant solution to remove Mr. Saakashvili from active politics. This, of course, was not a publicized goal. It could be read clearly between the lines of US statements. It was not an official goal. But in my private, very informal talks with US officials in various capitals, clearly the US goal emerged, making sure that Mr. Saakashvili goes peacefully out, but make sure, or not make sure, the desirable outcome would be for the Georgian United National Movement to win about 60%, more or less, of parliamentary seats, ensuring a strong and viable opposition with about 40%, so as to ensure continuity of governance, continuity of strategic policy, but at the same time a strong, viable opposition in parliament and checks and balances between government and opposition plus civil society. It seemed a reasonable agenda, undeclared, implicit everywhere, and it seemed like a reasonable agenda. But I think it was an agenda that was too clever by half, because the election could not be fine-tuned or calibrated as much, or as subtly, and there were a lot of unpredictable variables in this election. Starting in January 2012, the Obama administration started talking about a peaceful transfer of power. That was a recurrent formula. It kept coming back in all the statements, a peaceful transfer of power, as if the transfer was a foregone conclusion. In other words, prejudging the outcome. And the message seemed to be clear. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and, of course, other administration officials told Georgia publicly to hold, quote, model elections, and, quote, elections to the highest international standards, which was completely wrong and increased domestic political pressures in Georgia. You cannot expect Georgia to hold model election or the highest international standards. You can expect in Georgia progress from one electoral cycle to the next, and documented progress from one electoral cycle to the next, which has been happening in Georgia. For example, the 2010 countrywide local elections were assessed as a clear progress over previous elections. The United States and the European Union, in the final months of the campaign in Georgia, pressured the government not to strictly enforce the election financing campaign financing laws. Those campaign finance laws were designed to prevent state capture through state purchase. They were not consistently enforced during the final months of the electoral campaign. Now about cohabitation. Cohabitation is an important issue, but the main basis for pursuing this goal is to preserve political stability in Georgia, avoid turmoil, before October 2013. In other words, cohabitation is a short-term issue. It's important, and we must ensure cohabitation for the sake of stability in Georgia until October. But then the issue of cohabitation lapses. What is our policy beyond October 2013? The third combination of setbacks in foreign policy. I already mentioned this, referred to it briefly in the foregoing minutes. Apart from the issue of relations with Azerbaijan, Armenia, Turkey, there is, of course, the relationship with Russia. The government seems to pursue two contradictory objectives. At the declarative level, to continue the quest for joining NATO, but at the same time, to improve relations with Russia. These objectives are inherently contradictory. We don't know how the tension between these two objectives will be resolved. But we need to be aware and to tell the government that these two objectives are inherently contradictory. The United States does not have, at the moment, a regional policy towards the South Caucasus, nor a clearly developed policy agenda in Georgia, apart from the preservation of stability until October 2013. This is not a new problem for the US foreign policy. The US dropped the baton or mantle of leadership in the South Caucasus already during the first term of the Bush administration. And this trend has continued, has even intensified during the first term of the Obama administration. Policy toward Georgia, until up to this point, has no longer been related to US policy toward Europe. US policy toward the South Caucasus as a region, and toward Georgia, including Georgia, is at its most effective when it is being pursued as an extension of US policy toward Europe, in the context of diversifying Europe's energy supplies away from dependence on Russia, in the context of opening up the transit route to Central Asia for European consumer countries. This is, of course, where Georgia is key. The United States has allowed these policy objectives to lapse or to descend to second or even third level of priorities. This also explains, in part, the readiness of the United States and of Europeans to see Mr. Saakashvili removed from active policy making because he had become an irritant in the West's relations with Russia. What the United States can, in my opinion, should do in Georgia and the region is to reintegrate policy toward Caucasus, the South Caucasus, with policy towards Europe, pursue the energy security agenda on the entire front from Central Europe to Central Asia, including Turkmenistan, to make sure that the transit corridor Azerbaijan-Georgia serves not only for Azerbaijani oil and gas, but to transit Turkmen gas to Europe, which would be a real game changer regarding Gazprom in Europe. And this is why we need a viable, stable Georgia, effectively governed, and a Georgia that does not hesitate between the two worlds of the West and Russia. Transit to Afghanistan and transit from Afghanistan is again a short-term issue. Georgia is an asset far beyond the end of operations in Afghanistan. It was also the government of President Saakashvili which turned joining NATO into an article of faith for the Georgian population. It was precisely that government that told the Georgian people that NATO is its only possible guarantee of the country's security. That was the relentless daily message from Mr. Saakashvili's government. We don't hear this kind of message from the new government. Somebody, I don't remember who, but somebody said it very appropriately, that mentioning the goal of joining NATO has become merely a talking point for the new authorities, but not a deeply held value. we need to educate the new and inexperienced leadership in that regard. We have to avoid the tendency whereby the new leadership would try to resolve its problems with Russia in bilateral channels away from the existing multilateral channels. For example, don't discuss the futures or any eventual settlement on Abkhazia and South Ossetia, don't discuss it with the Russians, discuss it only in the Geneva framework. Don't discuss regaining access for Georgian product to the Russian markets on a bilateral basis. Discuss it only in the framework of the World Trade Organization. There are a lot of temptations on the part of the new leadership to go into bilateral channels with Russia. This is what they know. It's easy. They have difficulty speaking English. They are comfortable with the Russian culture and negotiating culture. They see Russia as looming overwhelmingly on the border, and they perceive the West as, to put it mildly, uncertain of its steps. The United States should continue using in its public rhetoric the term occupation with regard to Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Since Secretary Clinton left office, the administration does not do that anymore. And even Secretary Clinton has not used that term for some months. This needs to become part of the American official discourse. And the United States needs to team up with the Europeans in a proactive policy regarding Georgia, not merely to endorse European assessments of Georgia's internal political processes, but to be proactive in a strategic sense on the transit and energy security agenda. To conclude, engagement with the new authority is indispensable. It has to be pursued. It has to be pursued with clear eyes. We need to draw certain lines regarding what is acceptable in terms of internal political behavior. If we don't draw certain lines, then we might find ourselves, in terms of policymaking, subject to a salami process, whereby the new authorities cut off one slice of the political salami today, another one tomorrow, and so on in a gradual process. But we need to have clear standards and communicate them clearly to the new leadership, not in a coercive way, not in a lecturing way, as the United States is unfortunately too good at doing, but combined with incentives. And I think this needs to be paralleled with a similar approach to the Ukrainian leadership. If we don't hold the new authorities to accountability with regard to selective justice, for example, things will get even worse, and it will make it difficult for ourselves to pursue engagement. Recently, in a meeting with Maya Panjikidze in one European capital, because of CHASM rules, I cannot say where and when, I suggested to Maya Panjikidze that the new government should not confront the West with the kind of dilemma that Ukraine is confronting the West, namely, acting strategically to include the new Georgian government regardless of its domestic performance, or to act normatively and ostracize the new government. This is the dilemma with which the West is having difficulty coping in Ukraine. The new government should not confront us with the same dilemma in Georgia. Thank you.
Okay, Vlad. Well, thank you everyone for such a great, insights and sharing your thoughts on the region. Today we're going to open the floor to the questions and answers, and to those of you, I'm sure many of you have questions and may, obviously want to challenge these presentations and may disagree. So I think we were going to call on you first. Is that, Ms. Tina Kidasheli is here from the chairwoman of the Georgian Foreign Affairs Committee in the Parliament, so I wanted to call on her first. And then I'll call on each individually. So,
thank you very much. Thank you, first of all, for this event, for hosting this event, and for having Georgia on radar again. I'm actually the chair of the Georgia EU committee, not the Foreign Relations Committee. Mr. Tedu Japaridze is the chairman. I just wanted to reflect on some of the points, as I guess I'm the only one who represents the current government in this audience. And starting with short comment about the jobs part, as Mr. Cornell was saying. I absolutely agree and subscribe to basically every word that you said in your presentation about the questions, doubts, things to be addressed. As for the jobs, yes, this is one of those things that we will, that was the requirement of these elections, why the people went to the polls together with justice, and this is absolutely correct definition of the main agenda of the 1st of October elections. It's too early to talk about how many jobs the government will produce, but what we can already talk about, as there was so much judgmental talking already about the things that are happening in Georgia, is that there are 680,000 families in Georgia that are already starting from 2 weeks ago Monday, got the job. In the villages, these are the local farmers, very small farmers who've been getting the involved in the state program. Their work is insured. They will get enough subsidies for their agricultural works, and the product that they will be producing will be insured to be sold. So if we go by the understanding of self-employed being as a job, which is in most of the cases in the agricultural and rural areas, then we can say, again, in the line of what we've heard today here, that there are already 680,000 people additionally benefiting from the state and from the programs offered by the new government. It's just one example. I can go on with other sectors, obviously, as well, including the education, but it's going to take too much of the time.
We only have a little bit of short time,
absolutely.
So please,
That's why there are other issues that I'm not going to go with everything now. Another important issue that I believe I need to reply on is that new government did not manage to legitimize the prosecutions. That was one of the issues which is on the air, and you hear it in many different places. Well, here is a very short answer to it. Already in November, both leaders of the Georgian Dream Coalition, the Prime Minister and Speaker of Parliament, made a statement. And they've addressed the world that anybody who is interested, who has questions, who has doubts, who needs legitimacy for the prosecutions that are on, is welcome to Georgia. The only way it can be checked and ensured is the transparency. All the transparency is there, and fortunately and luckily, we already have ODR monitors who will be monitoring those high-profile court cases. And also, we have invited Commissioner Foulet from the European Union to designate a special representative on every single case that is under the question, and if anybody has any question. And Mr. Hammerberg is right now in Tbilisi, just arrived on Tuesday, and he'll be staying for 2 weeks and then spending another 3 months in Georgia. So this is, first of all, and that's what I want to make sure that everybody understands, it's in our interest that the transparency in those cases are guaranteed, because we are absolutely 100% sure that this is about the justice. These are the cases every democracy would go for. I think this is all what democracy is about. When there is a crime, crime needs to be investigated and perpetrators need to be punished. But again, the only way we can check the legitimacy of those cases is to have full information. It's not by statements I make here or current opposition members will make here. No, it is about the checking facts, checking the reality, the true stories, and going with those. And the very last point that I cannot leave without being addressed is about, I'm not gonna talk about Mr. Socor's statement a lot because I did not find myself in his description of what the coalition is, so I guess he keeps talking about imaginary Georgia that never existed on the earth before and right now as well. But there is one very important point about the electoral behavior that was raised here. Mestia was mentioned as a place very strange why ruling party has lost, because, as it was mentioned, Saakashvili has invested so much in modernizing it. The main reason and the answer to this question is very simple. It goes throughout Georgia, and it's true for every other place that the previous government lost. Yes, there were gigantic projects for Mestia, but it all happened with the confiscation of land from the people who lived in Mestia. It happened on the huge wave of imprisonment of those who disobeyed on giving up their property to the government. It happened as a result of beating up people, disappearances of a couple of families for a couple of weeks who were extremely and specifically strong in disobeying to this give me your property and be happy and go and live somewhere else. And this is why Mestia did not vote for Saakashvili, because the buildings, hotels, whatever is built in there, the people who live there felt are not for them. These are things for showing to the world how great the hotels are. All these Kempinskis, for example, that I don't know why we have them, and I'm very honest about it, because they are empty most of the time. If there is no USAID-sponsored conference, nobody uses them. We could have invested money in something that people can use, tourists will use, and will be really a mid-sized Georgia-level business opportunities on the one hand and touristic opportunities on the other hand, where everybody benefits. But these shining mega projects that were built in Georgia were not something that were seen by Georgians as bringing benefit, jobs, or bringing any other positive to the country other than those nice buildings standing there. And the same goes for Kutaisi. He lost Kutaisi because 3,060,000 was spent, 360 million was spent on the building of parliament. 360 million in a city which does not have a water. And I won't go up beyond that list, because
thank you for that.
So these are the patterns that we need to remember. And again, here is the invitation to Mr. Socor, first of all, to come to Georgia, check the cases, check every single local official you feel was forced to resign. By the way, these are the people who were members at the local level of the Communist Party, Zviadgam Sakhurdia's government, Shevardnadze and Saakashvili, and they are always with the winners. That's the reality of the post-Soviet Georgia, unfortunately.
Well, thank you very much for your comments, and very much appreciated. Before you respond, we'll go ahead and take a couple of questions. So we'll go to the back and work our way to the front, so, and then we'll get to this side. So in the back, there were two hands. And please identify yourself.
Margarita Zanova, the Jamestown Foundation. I have a question. What is happening with Georgia's policy towards the North Caucasus? We didn't talk about this today. It was a policy developed by the Saakashvili government, very well received in the North Caucasus. Of course, the recognition of the Circassian genocide was part of it, but we now see that Mr. Ivanishvili is going to Sochi Olympics. He announced already that. So what is happening with the policy? Thank you.
And I'll take one more question before we jump on that. Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is George Shingale. I'm one of the activists of Georgian community in New York and a member of United National Movement. My question is, I heard a lot of things about the analysis, but I don't see any prognosis from the realistic point of view. What, in current situation, United States government and European countries can do for Georgia, not only must do, but can do, especially when we have a new Secretary of State here who has been lobbied by Armenian community, and also if there will be any the changes in internal situation in Georgia. Let's say President uses its power to disassemble the parliament and also government. What would be the reaction from the West? So thank you very much.
Thank you. You want to take one more? Or, yeah, take one more. And who is, I started in the back. I'd like to, this lady here has been waiting. Right here on the front row.
Hi, Sarah Bechor, graduate student at Georgetown University. Mr. Wilson, you mentioned the tectonic plates that are shifting for Georgia's foreign policy, and I was wondering if you all three could talk about the tectonic plates that are possibly shifting to the south in Iran, and what Georgia's foreign policy concerns are, and also what impacts various trajectories or scenarios of the Iranian nuclear crisis could have for Georgia particularly, and for its neighbors in the South Caucasus.
Who wants to go first?
Yeah. Let me take the North Caucasus question from Margarita. I think I tried to address the other question about what can and should the US and the European Union do. I tried to address this in my presentation. Regarding the North Caucasus, however, the new government has closed the PIC television channel, which was broadcasting in Russian to the North Caucasus. Apparently, the new government believed that this could improve Tbilisi's relations with Moscow. The outgoing government had developed an especially creative policy toward the South Caucasus by abolishing visa requirements for Russian citizens, all Russian citizens, including residents of the North Caucasus republics. It did so basically for two considerations. One was to avoid the recurrence of the situation in which Russia covertly uses North Caucasus groups to subvert or attack Georgia, as happened during the war in Abkhazia in the 1990s, and as it happened again in South Ossetia in 2008. There is a negative historical legacy between the peoples of the North Caucasus, or some groups in the North Caucasus, and Georgians, a long-term legacy of the Russian wars in the North Caucasus in the first half and middle of the 19th century, when the Georgians acted as allies of the Russian Empire, and which resulted, of course, in the mass ethnic cleansing of some North Caucasus groups. This legacy turned out to be surprisingly alive in the 1990s, when Russian secret services enlisted the cooperation of the so-called Confederation of the North Caucasus Peoples to throw them against Georgia during the civil war and external intervention in the 1990s in Abkhazia. And then there were atrocities there perpetrated on Georgian territory in Abkhazia by those groups, and there were atrocities again in South Ossetia in 2008. Georgia wants to avoid this situation and to overcome that historic legacy. It has recognized the genocide of the Circassian people. The PIC television station was intended to advertise Georgia as a place for the residents of the North Caucasus to come down for studying, for medical treatment, on higher standards in Georgia compared to the North Caucasus republics, as a travel route to places of pilgrimage in the Middle East, for business, entertainment, and generally for people-to-people contact. It was an exceptionally creative initiative. I don't know whether this will continue. It seems to be suspended. And the discontinuation, the termination of the PIC television channel is symptomatic in that regard. Thank you.
Maybe I'll pick up on a couple of points. First, let me thank Tina Kadasheli for your statement. I thought the points you made on the transparency of the process going forward are of utmost importance, and I think that kind of commitment coming from coalition government figures is quite important and will be an important test over the coming months. If I could pick up on two of the questions. One, the Iran question is of the utmost strategic importance, and it's a glaring oversight that we hadn't touched on that earlier. So thank you for asking that. The implications are profound for Georgia. As you know, Batumi has become such an interesting outlet for many Iranians to a nearby outlet to a different kind of culture, a different kind of government environment, different kind of life. And so if you think about any issue facing the United States right now, Iran is probably almost always at number one. How this issue plays out during the administration is going to be of utmost strategic importance, one of the most important challenges on our national security agenda right now, both for Europe and the United States. And so that adds a layer of extreme importance to geography and to Georgia, Azerbaijan, given their obvious proximity to Iran, and adds a new, completely eclipsing layer of different strategic interests that we have in the region that sort of go beyond the conversation we've been having on Afghanistan for a while. And so part of it is, on the one hand, I welcome the way Batumi can serve as a social experiment for Iranians on vacation. But it's also one of these watch out issues, and that even when I was in government, a fair number of conversations that Tbilisi needs to be careful in its management of its relations with Tehran. Tbilisi's lifeline is its strong relationship with the West. And there's no quicker way to put at risk that relationship than by getting crosswise on some delicate issues with Iran. And Iran will be creative, both overtly and covertly in the region in terms of its actions. Georgia, for example, retains enormous support in the U.S. Congress. There's no better way to chip away at that than getting crosswise on something on Iran. That said, I actually think that Iran provides a real strategic rationale for a mature relationship with Georgia, a mature strategic dialogue with Georgia on issues that raise Georgia's sights beyond its own domestic issues to the role that it can and should play on the international stage, and one of strategic importance. So handled right, it's actually a real opportunity for Georgia on our national security agenda. And just briefly on the question on what can the United States and Europe do more and the reactions from the West, I mean, I begin first with this as a posture that what we begin by doing is saying that if Georgia sticks true to its words, its values, its commitment to democracy, free markets, reforms, that it actually has a home in our community, it has a home in our institutions, and that we stand by those commitments and we stand by that vision. That is a first order priority. But what I also tried to argue is that I think we actually just aren't observers in this process. It's up to the United States and Europe, I think, to bring forward the tools, the advice, to get in the game, if you will, to help Georgia succeed as it goes through this very difficult process. And that's why the European Union is deep in comprehensive free trade agreement. Issues like that are so important to providing the stepping stones towards this vision.
Thank you, Damon. Oh, sorry, yes. Let's go to this young lady here in the yellow, and then followed by the gentleman behind. We'll take 2 questions.
Thank you so much. My name is Elizaveta Igorova. I'm research assistant at the Fund for Peace. I have 2 questions for Vladimir. First, how do you perceive Ivanishvili's attitudes toward building relations with Russia, as we all know that he is a businessman and he previously had assets and business in Russia also, then he closed it and moved on to elections. And the second one, how do you think, what are the chances for Vakhtang Hladze, now supported by Ivanishvili, to win these presidential elections coming in October 2013? Thank you.
Did you have it directed towards any person? Or Mr. Socor?
And then the gentleman.
You, okay. And then Mr.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very informative and quite outspoken panel. My name is Wolfgang Danzberg-Gruber, Liechtenstein Institute at Princeton University. I have a couple of comments, and I have 1 or 2 strategic questions. I'm particularly grateful, however, to my young colleague from Georgetown that the Iran issue was brought up. Let me first begin in the strategic dimension. You mentioned a lot the issue of East-West dimensions. You nearly not mentioned the North-South. the whole Iranian debate gets into a total different light if we also speak about the special relationship between Israel and Azerbaijan on the strategic level. And speak specifically about the strategic north-south dimension as it goes from Abkhazia down to Armenia. It's not difficult to read through some of the Russian statements, and especially during the maneuvers last fall in close vicinity of the elections in Georgia, to see how important it is for Russia to have a corridor for Armenia, land corridor, at its disposition. And I have now to add another strategic dimension, Syria. I'm on my way to the Middle East again this evening, and I don't need to tell you the connection between Syria, the conflict, and Armenia, and the Circassians, and Abkhazia, and Russia, and the connections on illegal weapons lines through the Caucasus, from the Balkans, and go on. So, on the level of strategic dimensions, the entire Caucasus is like Switzerland and Austria in the old days, an entire north-south cross. And Georgia and Azerbaijan will, and that is part of the answer to the question about the future, will be a barometer of the situations in the larger macro region as it develops strategically. Now, a couple of points about the European Union. I'm an adopted, loving citizen of the United States of America. I have never been more challenged than by defending American domestic policy and foreign policy. And it's of a particular special pleasure for me to have this session today here on March 1st, 2013. And as Glen rightly mentioned, there's a key term right now, which I was reminded when I walked through Union Station at 8 o'clock. Sequestering. Many people spoke about it right there in the coffee shop.
Can we get to the question, please?
The question is, the United States of America has to speak with Bismarck or Henry Kissinger to confront its own challenges as well. And beware that whatever we stand for, we are judged by whatever we do also domestically. How does this affect our relationship with the EU? I leave this up to your convention. However, there was one country in the EU which has been, wait a moment, which has been and should be mentioned, and that I really would like to bring in, and you should please talk about this, Germany. The relationship between Germany, Georgia, and Germany in the EU, and Germany in the United States is of key. And with this, thank you very much.
Who wants to? Well, one question is directed to you, Vlad. So.
I'll try to answer the first question. I'm not sure if I understood it correctly. What, if any, is the connection between Ivanishvili's assets in Russia and his leadership of Georgia? Was this the question?
How he was perceived
Once again, from the beginning.
How he was perceived?
Please.
Since Ivanishvili has his own business in Russia,
yeah.
So he definitely had some ties and maybe some connections there. Then he moved to Georgia, and now he is a prime minister. So what is his policy towards Russia now?
Oh.
Will it be warm step-by-step policy, or he will move towards native?
Oh, I see. Yeah, I understand. So I think the implication or the implicit question is, do we have a conflict of interest between Ivanishvili's assets being located in Russia and his being the leader of Georgia? Of course, this issue arose throughout the election campaign. I never assessed Ivanishvili as a Russian tool, Russian stooge. That's what never my assessment of Ivanishvili. But I did raise the question that throughout his the years of his residing in Georgia, the Russian authorities allowed Ivanishvili to continue to draw profit from his Russian business and allowed his Ivanishvili's assets to increase from approximately $4 billion when he moved to Georgia to $6.5 billion in 2012. So clearly there is some kind of relationships there. I don't know what. I don't regard Ivanishvili as part of a Russian plot. He may well want to be his own master, but he's clearly inexperienced. He clearly, and in any normal country, there would be a conflict of interest between a leader who has his assets in another country, which is an outspoken adversary of his own country, and being the leader of this country targeted by the other country. We don't know how this will be resolved. I don't have any intelligence information. It is something to be reflective about.
Anybody else? Damon?
No. Let me just pick up on a couple of comments of Professor Don Speckgruber. First, to just comment that he may not recall, but I had the pleasure of taking one of his courses when I was a student at Princeton, so it's just it's a real pleasure to see you here, indeed. And I actually just couldn't agree more with what he said. I think the North-South dimension is extraordinarily important. Picking up on just two pieces of that, I think your point on the sequester is absolutely fundamental. I mean, one of my biggest concerns is that you can feel the U.S. moral authority in the world is seeping away as we go through this drama of ridiculous inability to manage our own affairs. I mean, the United States has a history of being an enormously influential democracy because we are a self-correcting democracy. We make mistakes, our system responds, we fix it, and the world sees that. And I think that's one of the big tests we're facing right now, that just imagine if we had a grand deal on Capitol Hill right now, what wind it would put in the sails of our economy, of our position in the world, of our moral leadership, of our political leadership, our economic leadership. The talk of a more complex world, it would be, no, the U.S. is back. We're one deal away from an enormous sense of strength, recovery, and enthusiasm. In the absence of that deal, our ability to do anything, including to play pivotal roles in a region like the Caucasus, is impacted. It has sapped our authority and strength. And so I think our number one national security foreign policy issue is that. And the second point, your comment on Germany, is absolutely key. I mean, as the U.S. has stepped back, Germany has stepped forward. And if you look at how the East is playing out, Germany is taking on a traditional, important, historic role. If Moldova goes right, it's because of a German heavy hand. Even in the heated debates in the Bucharest summit, Chancellor Merkel was always more willing to lean much more forward on Ukraine than Georgia. So the success of Ukraine, Moldova, and the Eastern Partnership is helped by Sweden, Lithuania, Poland, but Germany is critical there. German ambivalence towards Georgia will be an albatross on Georgia's path towards Europe. I think there's an opportunity for that to evolve and shift, and certainly the election gave an opportunity to do so, and that's a critical ingredient in getting this right.
We're going to get to these questions here in the back. The gentleman, yes, wait for you. Yes, we do, because it's being taped and we're going to post this to the web, so we do need your microphone.
Very well. My name is Richard Harrington. I'm the owner of the American Georgian Travel Group. It's a small company that operates tours. We focus exclusively on taking American tourists to Georgia. Two questions for the panel. Do you foresee any change in the business environment in Georgia? And the second is, do you see any change in the security situation? Understand, I'm taking American tourists to Georgia. Thank you.
And we're going to take another question over here. Yes, right there, Peter, the gentleman right there. Yes.
Andrei Larian of Cato Institute. One observation and one question for the panel. One observation is, just seems to me nobody mentioned economic collapse that happened in Georgia over the last 4 months. That economic growth went from roughly +7% last September to -2% this January. So that just, I think it's interesting event that needs to be reflected somehow, and the impact of the new administration on the economic environment and business situation in Georgia. But my question is slightly different. Somebody from the panel has already mentioned the so-called sphere of privileged interest, the concept that has been proclaimed by then President of Russia Medvedev back in July 2008. Assuming what has happened over these almost 5 years since then, and assuming the substantial changes in US administration's policy towards Georgia, should a member of the panel consider this concept is winning in reality? Is it success, some kind of gradual success on the part of the Russian administration? I mean just the post-Soviet space as a sphere of privileged interest for Moscow.
Yes?
Yeah, I can take a stab at the first questions from the gentleman. I think on the business issue, I'm not a specialist on this, but I think there are some positive developments and a bunch of questions. I think the positive development is that as far as I understand, and again, I'm not a specialist, the very specific type of structure that existed, which affected a number of many businesses negatively in Georgia in the last years of the Saakashvili administration, has been removed. The question is whether that is being replaced by the rule of law or by somebody else taking over the role that some of the people were, so to speak, supervising business, if you will, were taking. And I think there are mixed signals on this issue. There are candidates, if you will, that would like to replace the system that existed with something similar. There are others within the new government who would like to simply do away with what existed and build a normal, free business environment. I think this is in a state of flux. We will see over the next few months and years what exactly is, how the business landscape in the country lands, if you will. I think it's too early to say, but I think definitely there is an opportunity for what could be a lasting progress in terms of the business environment, but we're certainly not there at this point. Partly because of the political instability and uncertainty, which I think at this point is the main risk for business and investors, and the fact that the very confrontational climate in the country's politics is not, it's not a good marketing for investing your money in Georgia at this point. So the quicker we can see an improvement of the situation, and I think the quicker the new government begins looking forward rather than backward. Mr. Ivanishvili still has a tendency to start his speeches and press conferences and meetings with the diplomatic corps with a long tirade against all the evils of the former government. Again, I think the quicker they can start looking forward and move beyond the past, the better it will be for business. As far as tourism is concerned, I think Georgia became a very safe country at the expense of very high rates of incarceration that were very often there were legitimate questions about the incarceration of the amount of people. We've seen over the past 4 months not a halving, but almost of the Georgian prison population. Whether this will it be, the basic question is, will it be possible to maintain the level of security in society with the practically halving of the prison population of the country? Again, I think because the information environment in Georgia is so polarized, we see, of course, the former government and the parliamentary minority arguing that there is already a collapse of the security situation in the country. I think that's probably exaggerated, but I think it's a legitimate question. What will happen now that that you have this very broad amnesties being promulgated? I understand the rationale behind it, but I think in many areas there seems to be a very broad brush with which this has been applied. From the issue of the political amnesty, which included very clearly convicted Russian spies that were released as part of an amnesty of political prisoners. I think that was very unfortunate, the way this list was quite broadly, very broadly defined. And I think with the amnesty in general, you have these questions. On the question of the sphere of privileged interest, I think it's much broader than Georgia, of course. But I think, yes, I think I would agree with you that the concept of a privileged sphere of influence is, in a sense, winning, and in a sense, it's losing. And I'll try to explain why. It's winning in the sense that I think in Russia, most observers, and you can see this in print in Russia, have concluded that the West has basically accepted the idea that Russia has a sphere of privileged interest in the former Soviet Union. That there is not the contestation, the geopolitical contestation in the Caucasus, Central Asia, and the east of Europe that there used to be. That would be, so to speak, and let me be clear, I mean, Secretary Clinton repeatedly said that we do not accept a sphere of influence. I hope Mr. Kerry will continue making these statements. But they have been at the declaratory level. If you look at the actual policies, it's clear that the US government has tended to forego pursuing its national interest in the former Soviet Union in order to safeguard the reset with Russia, because they know very well that what the Russians, the number one thing they want out of the reset is a recognition for the sphere of influence. They don't want to give them the recognition, but if the Russians think that they have it, that's fine. And in Europe, you have a similar logic. Now, why I think the sphere of privileged interest is not winning is because, in spite of the West leaving a walkover almost, if you will, if it had only been to the West, then the Russians would have their sphere of influence back, because nobody has really contested it in the past 4 or 5 years. And I think the war in Georgia was a decisive event for that. In that regard, is that in spite of the West's unwillingness, so to speak, to stand up against Russian reintegration efforts, if you want to put it diplomatically, it's not going very far. And it's not going very far because over the past 20 years, these countries have become real countries. Countries like Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and even small countries like Kyrgyzstan, who are very dependent on Russia, are not willingly, so to speak, being vacuumed up into the Russian sphere of influence. They are able to withstand through their various, in Central Asia, if the West is not there, they go and deal with the Chinese and other Asian powers, which help them provide them with this geopolitical pluralism, if you will. In the Caucasus, you find, thanks to the Syria crisis, the Turkish-Syrian relationship has collapsed, which has enabled Turkey to once again be a more positive force, supportive of Georgian NATO membership that it did not used to be immediately after the 2008 war, for example. So I think the sphere of influence, in terms of the highest level of abstraction of international politics, it's winning because it's not being opposed effectively by the West. But on the ground, it's not working because the Russians are not able to make it work. And it's thanks to the local countries and the local leaders, not thanks to our diplomacy.
I'd like to add just a little bit to what Svante just said, and I completely agree with what he said. In response to Andrei Ilarionov's question, thank you for that question. Of course, it is highly troubling that a made-in-Russia billionaire should take over Georgia. This in itself is a highly troubling development. It is also troubling at the level of, at the cultural level of generation change. We have an older generation in power now in Georgia, less westernized, less English-speaking, and more attuned to the Russian ways of doing economic business and political business. And Mr. Ivanishvili personifies this along with the parts of the Shevardnadze era nomenclatura, which are also part of his government. So yes, that's very troubling. And about the Russian sphere of privileged interests. The process by which such a sphere of Russian privileged interests might take shape is completely different from a Yalta-type agreement of partitioning territories on the map in terms of percentages of influence, or drawing a line between countries in one sphere or another. At present, this process, if it does work, it would work in a completely different way. Namely, through the deprioritization of these countries by West and its policies. Deprioritization, no explicit agreement, no percentage agreement, no Yalta-type deal. Simply deprioritization of these countries by the West can lead by default to the creation of a Russian sphere of privileged interests. I agree with Svante that the new leaderships are standing up against this. And incidentally, the countries that are standing up are, for the most part, they are most effective standing up, have presidential systems of government. Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan are standing up. And I would be remiss if I did not mention Belarus in this context, which also has a presidential system of government, and it is also trying to prevent its absorption into a Russian sphere of influence. The Western response should be active engagements with all these leaderships. Thank you.
We'll get to a couple, sorry. Yeah, we're almost out of time here, but I'm going to get to a couple more questions. My quick comment about your question about investment in Georgia. I do know of one foreign oil company, the new government approached about reopening the Black Sea oil, potential oil reserves offshore Georgia that they were trying to reinterest in Western companies to develop, which some of the Western companies had tried to look into in the 90s. And I do know one Western company that was scared away by the political instability or perception of instability in Georgia when the new government was trying to reopen those discussions on the oil reserves or potential oil reserves off the coast. So I do know one case. And there's another point I'd like to make. The new head of the NATO liaison office in Georgia is a German Bundeswehr officer. And I'd have to say that in terms of relations with NATO, I was told that the NATO liaison office has now doubled in size, going from 4 to 8 persons. So I do know that there's been, it seemed, a more active NATO presence here following the elections. I regret we're going to have to end a discussion here. Can you, one more question, or is this, you gonna, he's got to go. He's got to go. Damon's got to go. So, listen, sorry that I couldn't get to everyone today, and we are limited. We have to vacate the room, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone, but, you know, please, next time I promise you'll get to you. So thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you. I apologize. Thank you.
Not enough time, Vlad.
Not enough time. How long is she here?
Well, we got, can't get in everybody.